Hey, good morning, everybody. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Sorry for the slight delay. I've had audio technical issues, but so let's get this on the way. Yeah, we are still meeting online this week because of electrical grid maintenance at ITS. They will be shutting down the electricity from morning until late in the afternoon for maintenance purposes. So online again it is. Please do mark your attendance for those of you who haven't done so already. And this week, but I'll pop this slide open again once we're near the end of the session. Just in case any of you have missed or were unable to scan the QR code. So this week we'll be talking about, I'll be talking about landscapes, and this is where the built environment and the natural environment seems to come together, and the lines between the lines of the borders between what is humanly made and what is natural is somewhat blurred. And as a disclaimer, you will be exploring landscapes, or at least something at the landscape scale a little later on when you're actually, I think you're doing it now, aren't you? Site planning. So we will also talk of if you are doing site planning this semester, then we will explore landscapes a little further there. So landscapes are the fourth selected component or layer in this study of the built environment. And as I mentioned, it's a bit difficult for some people to perceive the landscape as a component of the built environment, because much of the landscape apparently seemed to consist largely or perhaps even entirely of natural features, including land, water, vegetation, animals, so any flora, fauna, or any living creatures, both wild and domesticated. Think of farms, farmlands. They have abundant natural features. Farmlands have animals, and they also have vegetation, but they are actually a form of the built environment, because it's highly controlled and highly engineered. However, there are also landscapes that feature a combination of humanly created processes of design and products with or within the natural environment. And this component integrates the human or the social, and then the environmental and the technical aspects of the built and natural land that creates a setting create a setting or a scape. And even the most natural appearing landscape has undoubtedly been shaped, altered, or perhaps even manipulated to some degree by humans. Think of the farmlands that I just talked about. Or perhaps plantations, perkebunan. But plantations are a little bit more obvious because trees don't grow in a straight line. as I said, plants can be arranged in a way, they can be positioned, placed, or manipulated by human hands, and even partly created through genetic manipulation by humans. So, although our land, or the land, is the ultimate natural resource of ancient earthly origin, it can be formed. It is highly malleable. Can be formed. It can be shaped by human hands or machines. So landscapes incorporate a variety of shapes, sizes, and scales. Um, they range from small, intimate, or residential gardens, urban courtyards, plazas, parks, planned unit developments, um, large recreational developments, and regional watershed management, or ecological plans. Landscapes can be found in rural settings, suburban settings, or even urban places. Uh, sorry, or even urban places. And landscapes usually feature creative combinations of natural features such as vegetation or plant materials, trees, water, and a display of open space, and humanly made components such as structures, like perhaps that you see here, sorry, and structures, outdoor furnishings, walkways, bikeways, and roads, parking spots, parking spaces for vehicles. Um, Most importantly, landscapes are alive, a lot more so than the previous components that we talked about, interiors, products, interiors, and structures. So they're more alive in the sense that they grow, they change, they develop, they evolve over time, celebrating the wonderful delights of oxygen-producing plants and the changing beauty of the seasons. If you happen to find, or if you happen to experience landscapes in a multi-season setting, landscapes in our geographical settings tend to stay the same way or a similar way throughout the year. In four season countries, landscapes change color, they do change shape to a certain extent, due to seasonal varieties and the different traits that the vegetations have. So imagine a park that is lush green in spring and summer, and then in autumn they start to turn, and then in autumn the green turns to yellow or reddish hue, before ultimately displaying much more monotonous colors, because they because the vegetations lose their leaves. Members of the design disciplines or professions that work at the levels of landscapes are usually called landscape architects, but depending on the scale, they can also be known as landscape or regional planners. Now, a clearer understanding of the various dimensions of this component can be gained by thinking about the similarities and differences among the three terms: landscape, landscaping, and landscape architecture or landscape planner. So when we talk about landscape is a portion of land which the eye can comprehend in a single view. That's your landscape. Anything that your eyes can see in a single view, that is a landscape. that is considered as a landscape, especially its pictorial aspects. Now, a picture representing a natural scenery, for example, such as that, to improve by and landscapes can be improved by an extensive effort such as landscape architecture, or even can be improved by even the smallest effort of gardening. Other similar words can be formed by changing the first syllable, such as not only landscape. So you can change the first syllable and it becomes seascape, it becomes townscape, it becomes riverscape. Now they mean, of course, a portion of the environment, either natural or built, that can be perceived in a single view. I see an ocean, I see a beach, you call that a seascape. I see a picturesque city, you call that a townscape, and so on. As noted, this single view has a variety of scales, ranging from an enclosed yard, perhaps, to the panoramic view from an airplane or mountaintop. Now, if we accept the aforementioned definition, which links scale to the human view, we can begin to understand the general and specific characteristics of a term that some would argue covers any landscape at any scale, just over the fence, just beyond our fence, or far distant hills. There are other three terms associated with landscapes: landscaping, landscape architecture, and the landscape profession. So landscaping means to improve the landscape, to make the land more beautiful, especially by adding natural features to it: vegetation, trees and plants, water features, land and rock formations, and so on. It is synonymous with landscape gardening and gardening in general. The second term that I'd like to introduce is landscape architecture, which some of you may have already known. It is a profession focused on the art and science of designing or planning the natural and built traits and the stewardship of land to produce the best aesthetic, scientific, even and even more so, the best ecological conditions. And landscape architecture is usually a practice where you consider the uses to which the land is to be put. So if you have a vast empty plot of land, and you determine what you were going to do with it through scientific measures, of course, as you are probably doing right now with site planning. That's called landscape architecture. And then the landscape profession, which implies public declaration, knowledge of the craft or the art and science of the design, management, and planning of landscapes. Now, the landscape profession doesn't only involve the landscape architecture itself. It also includes education, apprenticeship, and professional licensing. And if you're interested, if you're interested about getting professional licensing for the landscape profession in Indonesia, look no further than the Indonesian Society of Landscape Architects, atau Ikatan Arsitek Lanskap Indonesia. Scan the QR code or visit their website to find out more about what the Indonesian Society of Landscape Architects are all about, what their activities are, and the certification processes. If you're interested, please, I need to remind you that the QR code presented in front of you right now is not the QR code to mark your attendance. Now, there are many attributes or features to a landscape. There are physical attributes such as the attributes of the land itself, the topography, the hydrology, soils, the geology, and the microclimate. And then there are biological attributes, ecological communities, vegetation, wildlife, wildlife habitats, and so on, and other, and of course included in the biological attributes are the processes, the processes that occur in the biological processes that occur inside any given landscape. Think of the circle of life. Think of the circle of life song from the Lion King, and think of it and place that circle of life in a landscape. That's what I mean by the biological attributes, namely the ecological communities. And then we have the cultural attributes: land use, open space, regulations, property, sensory perception, and infrastructure, and so on, of which you will be focusing more on throughout your academic career in our department. You'll be tackling a lot of land use. You'll be tackling and calculating a lot of open space requirements and open space distribution, regulations. Obviously, we often talk about and mention regulatory and legal frameworks, property, which you will explore even more so in housing and settlements and in urban management further on. And of course, sensory perception, which we will explore in the urban design units, such as urban design theory and urban morphology, and applied urban design or urban design practice. Infrastructure as well, of course. Now, if we look deeper into so why are we not focusing on the physical attributes and the biological attributes? Because the physical and the biological attributes are generally given. We use our knowledge and our capacity in translating and manipulating the cultural attributes to modify the physical attributes, but at the same time, hopefully not impact the biological attributes too much by changing the land use and changing or modifying the open space distribution and open space ratio, and providing infrastructure for our daily activities. You are not disrupting ecological communities very much. You're not destroying the habitats of local animals, especially if those animals happen to be endangered, and so on. Now, cultural resources. We need to understand cultural resources in order to understand the cultural and historic context. Sorry, the word historic is a bit obscured by the clouds. So cultural resources are those tangible and intangible aspects of cultural systems, both past and present, that are valued by or that are valued by or that are a representative of a given culture, or that contain information about culture. Development that fits the site, is responsive to the site's cultural and historical context. By incorporating in new development the design styles and construction, or construction materials, sorry, the design styles and construction materials that are indigenous to the region, site planners and architects can strengthen a community sense of place. One unique approach to what I just mentioned, development that fits the site, cultural and historical context. The university where I studied a couple of years ago happens to sit on indigenous land. Of course, Australia is a nation of settlers, not like our land, not like ours. So what the university builders or the university owners or managers, sorry, the university management, prior to building the campus, they consulted indigenous elders, they consulted indigenous historians, they consulted on what the land, what cultural significance does the land hold, the site or the location of the university or the future university or the future campus holds. Does it have any cultural, does it have any historical significance? Does it have any cultural significance? And what they found out was what the historical texts, historical records show is that that particular plot of land on which the Queensland University of Technology campus sits or stands has always been a place for learning. But of course, indigenous communities hundreds of years ago and thousands of years ago do not have universities, but the land on which the university campus sits used to be a place where the elders would pass on their knowledge, would pass on their values to the younger generation, to their descendants. So it has always been a place of learning, and so it is only fitting that they build a university on top of that land. So to continue that tradition, to continue and maintain the historical context of the land, and I think that this is a good approach, especially in our country, where we have tanah adat. We should not only consult. I think you are also taking land use. I think you're also taking land use planning this semester. So I think it is very important that we not only consult legal experts and land use administrators, but we also consult historians. We also consult local elders to find out the significance of that particular land, if we are to build on custodian land or customary land, tanah adat. And to keep that context alive, to keep that history alive throughout future generations, we can also do we can also do something like an acknowledgement to traditional owners, or acknowledgement to indigenous owners. For example, right after the national anthem, before we start an event, before we begin an event, say an academic seminar or any kind of meeting, any kind of congregational event, we would always sing the national anthem. Of course, we do that here as well. But right after that, just before anybody starts their keynote speech or deliver their lecture, they would always say a word or two to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which they conduct their activities. So they would usually say, I would like to acknowledge, or we acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of this land, and we pay respects and tributes to elders past, present, and future, that sort of thing. And I think that would be a very good tradition for us to start, to adopt. I know you might think, oh, that's just lip service, but the more you say it, I believe the more you internalize the value of it, the more you internalize, the more people internalize the value, and then ultimately it would reflect in their outlook and their behavior to some extent. So that's a little addition on cultural and historic contexts. And of course, if we happen to be building on a land that does not have a cultural or historical significance, we might be just building over an old neighborhood. Building over an old neighborhood, or building a new neighborhood. Well, even if the neighborhood does not have any cultural significance, but the neighborhood character, the neighborhood traits is there. And although it may not be culturally significant, but the building and the neighborhood buildings and neighborhood traits reflect a society's way of life, a society's lifestyle, a society's or a group of people's norms and values. And these are the sort of things that we'd like to preserve to a certain extent when we're, say, rejuvenating or revitalizing a neighborhood. We can do that by maintaining the building facades, maintaining the color schemes. Perhaps you're thinking of remodeling the buildings because they are structurally unsound. Well, perhaps you can erect a building that has at least a facade that resembles the surrounding buildings, rather than build something that is completely that completely contrasts the current building and neighborhood character. Why do I say that? We need to maintain, as best we can, we need to maintain building a neighborhood character when we're reshaping the landscapes? Is that I do believe that we have the capability, we have the capacity to shape our environment, but ultimately the environment that we shape then shapes us in return. but how do we maintain or how do we identify neighborhood character? Um, how do we identify it? How do we maintain it if we can't even identify these characteristics or this character? Character is such an intangible value that is reflected on tangible items. So understanding community character hinges on identifying its defining attributes. Kevin Lynch introduced the image of the city, and he developed a conceptual framework to assess urban structure or urban legibility. Legibility, if you translate that directly to our language, is kejelasan. It could also mean transparency or readability. So he developed this conceptual framework to assess urban structure, urban legibility, and to explain how people form cognitive maps or mind maps or mental images, mental maps of the built environment. Now, cognitive maps, Lynch theorized, aid orientation and movement or wayfinding. For some of us, if we lived in in a certain area for a certain period of time, for a long time, we just know how to navigate through that area. We just know how to get around, and that, according to Lynch, is due to the cognitive maps or the mental maps that have been embedded in our heads. But these cognitive maps are even more so, or even a lot easier to form in built environments or in places with a strong sense of place. The Lynch's conceptual framework consists of five elements, or 5 elements of urban form, or and these 5 elements form the basis, or form these 5 elements form what he calls the image of the neighborhood or image of the city. The first component is edges. Think of shorelines, think of streets, and any major changes in land use. So edges are basically borders. If there are major changes in land use or major contrasts in land use, say for example industrial estate and residential, then the border between the 2 land uses can be considered as an edge. But what if between the 2 land uses the border is a street, for example? Then that street becomes the edge for the two areas. But the streets are also streets can also be used as paths. For example, roads, streets, major walkways, or bike paths, for example. Districts is the next component. Think of that industrial estate thing. Think of neighborhoods, major institutions. ITS, for example, that's a big district. That's a major district. And then next after districts is nodes. Nodes, intersections, roundabouts, plazas, as in public open plazas, entrances, perhaps. So any place where one way to define node is when you look at a city square or an urban plaza, there is no sense of direction, so to say. People are going in multiple directions at the same time. So whereas on a path, you are moving along that designated path. But in a node, you can turn left if you want to, anytime you want to. You can turn right anytime you want to. You can turn back anytime you want to. You can keep moving forward in a straight line if you want to, or you can go diagonally instead. So there is no defined, there is no set linear path, so to say. So that's what nodes are. Nodes can also be, as I mentioned, an intersection, but an intersection, it can also be a place where two functions meet. For example, a terminal where pedestrians meet motorized transport, for example. That can also be considered as a node. And then last is landmarks. I think landmarks for themselves, any unique features, unique buildings. It can be bridges. I mentioned bridges because I absolutely love looking at bridges. It could be a sculpture, a statue or a sculpture of a prominent figure. I remember one of the landmarks in the city that I used to live in Germany was a statue of the two poets, Goethe and Schiller. Well, Goethe was a poet, but Schiller was a musician. So Goethe, Schiller, they were standing together, and that moment was immortalized in the form of a sculpture that lays in the heart of the city. That stands in the heart of the city. So that could be considered as a landmark as well. Natural features can also be landmarks. Think of waterfalls. Think of the Grand Canyon. Waterfalls. I think arguably one of the most beautiful waterfalls in the world, Madakaripura, which is not too far away from our backyard. Not too far away. It's still in our backyard, sort of. So that can also be considered as a landmark. Now, this conceptual framework is especially useful in assessing the character of the built environment in an area considered for redevelopment. So how are the edges? How are the paths? Where do they go? What are on the paths? What districts are there? Are there any districts? Are there any specific uses? Are there any specific places where people gather, nodes? Are there any specific landmarks? For example, Kapura. When you enter a certain neighborhood, usually they have a portal. They have a portal-like structure that signifies that you are entering a different territory. You are entering a different neighborhood. You are guests here, that sort of thing. So I think the five elements this conceptual framework that Kevin Lynch proposed is helpful in a way. Because we can organize the information that we receive, the information that we perceive from the built environment into a more structured and logical order, so to say. And that then helps us to determine the significance, determine the value, and determine what to do, and more importantly, determine what to do next. Another technique to assess the built environment is the figure ground mapping. This is a technique for assessing the texture or the grain of the built environment. Now, this involves mapping just two elements: the buildings, the building footprints, the figure, the black dots, and the spaces or the ground between the buildings, the white bit, which is pretty much everything else. The resulting map is known as a solid void, solid and a void map. I think you can guess which one is the solid, which one is the void. So the map, this solid void map reveals the texture of the built environment, much like much like when it's as if you're looking at a certain fabric, and you're feeling for its texture. You're touching it and feeling for its texture. Well, this is akin to that, but we're talking about the urban fabric instead. Now, this urban fabric texture can vary widely across different communities, even across a community. They can vary widely across. They can vary widely spatially, from block to block and across time, from decade to decade. Suburban buildings, for example, are typically freestanding objects in space, in contrast to urban buildings which are often connected and effectively shape the outdoor space. Figure ground diagrams are also particularly useful for informing the design and siting of new buildings. For example, if you want to, this sort of map can help you, can help you determine the building's size, what shape it should be, and where you should place it on the site. Excuse me. Now let's move to something. Smaller. Let's go back to structures for a bit. If you are to assess the character of a building, an assessment of building character considers at least the following attributes you see before you: facade, the facade height, facade width, and the facade proportions. Proportions of window and door openings, horizontal and vertical rhythms. This horizontal and vertical rhythms are a bit more difficult to explain. It's like it's almost like the ratio between horizontal lines that you see on a facade and the vertical lines and the vertical components that you see on a facade, and determining whether there is a pattern in the horizontal and the horizontal and the vertical elements. Another attribute would be the roof form, any signs and sidewalk coverings, and and the building's distance from the street itself, the setback from the street. Those are physical attributes or structural attributes that determine or that help determine the character of a building. And usually you can also determine the building's age, which era was it built, from these attributes, because certain eras usually have distinct styles, and these attributes, these parameters will help you will help you in determining that. So other than those character defining attributes, building height, style, year of construction, or location within the urban to rural continuum, a building typology can also be based on uses, for example. So other than the physical aspects that we just talked about, we can also have a look at what the building is used for. Single family houses, multi-family residential towers, perhaps, or mixed use residential and commercial developments, say shop houses, or any other typology that I might have forgotten. Religious structures, maybe, or sustainability practices. For example, water, energy efficiency, location efficiency, accessibility, or renovation status. Perhaps it's fully refurbished or high, or perhaps it carries with it high renovation potential. In an analysis of neighborhood attributes in British Columbia, there are Teed et al. Found the typology of 6 neighborhood types that spanned a continuum from rural to more urban areas. They're usually single-family houses, multi-family residential towers, and mixed-use residential or commercial development. And these three typologies are then broken down into more fine detail to form that. To form the neighborhood type. So the single family houses could be small footprints, pitched roofs, 1 to 2 stories high, multi-family residential towers, 5 to 12 stories, subdivided living units, and usually having retail use of the first floor and such. Mixed use residential commercial, like shop houses, the ground floor retail or office users, and then upper floor residential users. Usually 3 to 5 stories high, and generally having a rectangular and linear footprints. Much like the shop houses that we find here, ruko, rumah toko. Although the ru part of the ruko is usually used or utilized as storage rather than actual dwelling unit. Neighborhood and building typologies can be documented on image boards with photographs, or perhaps even annotated street elevations and street sections, and maps showing the locations of representative buildings or neighborhoods within each type. So I'm sorry if I get carried away, but if you've identified say, for example, the 5 components or the 5 elements of the image of the city, as Kevin Lynch has proposed, you can document that. Using maps, image boards, and photographs, and that will then help you put your thoughts onto paper, and help you analyze and determine what to do further. In addition to the influence of buildings, the character of the built environment is usually influenced by the circulatory system or the circulation system configurations, land use combinations, the size, placement, and design of outdoor open spaces, and construction materials also. Now, regionally distinctive construction materials include, for example, locally quarried stone, or in glaciated regions, boulders deposited during the last ice age. Native and naturalized vegetation can also contribute to a site's unique identity. Now, assessing existing neighborhood and community development patterns can inform more context-sensitive site planning and building design. neighborhood pattern books. You can document those maps that you use, that you've compiled to form a neighborhood pattern book to enable the design of new development that enhances the unique local character by repeating the best qualities of building and site design in that community and geographic region. Of course, we can't forget about public spaces or public places, and public places in any city are cultural resources that are also considered, that should be considered in assessing the neighborhood and community context. Community assets that contribute to a neighborhood's character and sense of place include parks, schools, libraries, community centers. Community center, I think the closest thing we have to a community center would be the Balai Airway. Libraries, we do have libraries, but usually they're not adjacent to a public square or a public plaza or a park. There are some community-based or community initiated libraries, Ruang Baca or Taman Baca, that are situated near public parks. For example, there is one near my house, just a couple of blocks away, a Taman Baca that is situated right next to an open field, open grassy field. Unfortunately, the Ruang Baca, the Taman Baca was shut down due to the pandemic. So it's been abandoned for the last couple of years. So coming back to this, public open spaces, they can provide not only visual amenities and outdoor recreational opportunities, but also space for stormwater management and other functions of green infrastructure. And both indoor and outdoor places, privately owned but open to the public, perform important social functions that help define the character of a place. So not only does it have a social function, it also has an environmental function. But of course, if you have hardscapes, extensive hardscapes, you still need to provide hard engineering or hard infrastructure to manage stormwater when rain comes. There are a couple of conceptual design principles when you're shaping landscapes. I'd like you to keep this in mind. When you're doing the site planning task. So open spaces first and foremost. Many communities generally try to limit urban sprawl and reduce the loss of open space. Then there are conservation open spaces, which are typically woodlands, grasslands, wetlands, and open water that provide a range of social benefits, including opportunities for outdoor recreation. One way open spaces can be protected is through regulatory approaches that restrict development rights on lands with significant environmental resources. Now, with skillful site planning based on a thorough site analysis, clustering buildings and infrastructure on the remaining site areas can protect environmentally sensitive areas and provide attractive settings for new development. Green infrastructure in the built environment provides many social, economic, and of course, ecological benefits. As we learn more about the structure and function of ecosystems and their importance to human health, safety, and welfare, planning
and design professionals are integrating more green spaces into site, neighborhood, and community plans. Both natural and developed open spaces can provide, as I mentioned earlier, opportunities for outdoor recreation. Outdoor spaces can also help strengthen community identity and help determine the quality of life and even serve as a catalyst for local economic development. And then circulation networks, when you design a site circulation network, you do need an understanding of the site's context, including the existing transportation systems adjoining the site, the entry and arrival sequences to on-site destinations. They must begin at one or more access points on the site's periphery, entrances to the site and to the buildings, and major pedestrian walkway intersections. They're places to develop plazas and seating areas. These pedestrian nodes warrant, or pedestrian intersections, they need an appropriate design treatment, perhaps even using special paving, special lighting, planting, and or site furniture. Circulation network design principles include establishing gateways and creating a strong sense of arrival. The primary entrance, to a site could be located, for example, on axis with the proposed building, or some other significant on-site or off-site feature. And the visual anchor or terminus for an organizing axis, this axis that I'm talking about is an imaginary line, of course, could be a large specimen tree, a hill, a prominent landform, another building perhaps, or another unique natural or cultural feature. And then buildings. If your site planning program calls for siting one or more new buildings, then the site analysis must identify suitable locations for building construction. A development pod for a single building must be large enough to accommodate the building, along with spaces for parking, service areas, and pedestrian amenities. Land development projects on large sites usually pose unique challenges and opportunities. The clustering of buildings can reduce a development's impervious surfaces and lower construction costs for streets, utilities, and other infrastructure. Clustering can also minimize site disturbance, and if the buildings are carefully sited, they can also protect natural drainage networks and other natural or cultural features. Now, these undeveloped open spaces can be amenities accessible from the buildings that are clustered on the remaining parts of the site. Building placement can also have a large effect on the building's design and operation. Energy use for cooling, heating, and lighting, for example, is influenced not only by the building's design, but also by its location on the site. Seasonal wind direction and velocity and solar exposure are climatic factors that should be considered when siting buildings. Open space is a vital and, more often than not, underappreciated component of the built environment. Outdoor space in the built environment is, of course, defined by a ground plane, and to varying extents by vertical and overhead planes. Many of the best designed outdoor spaces are partially enclosed by buildings, landforms, trees, or vegetation, or other vertical elements that define outdoor rooms and outdoor corridors. Although less enclosed than indoor rooms and corridors, linked sequences of pedestrian-friendly outdoor spaces can also strengthen a community sense of place and enhance its livability. So, for example, this is an example of an outdoor room or an outdoor corridor. Depending on if you're standing still under the shade, then you might consider this as an outdoor room, because it has a floor, it has walls, so to say, and it also has a ceiling. But if you're walking along the path, then you can call this an outdoor corridor instead. And perceptions of the built environment are in part a function of how visible attributes such as color, shape, size, texture are spatially arranged. For the sake of simplicity, enhancing the aesthetics of the built environment can be reduced to three fundamental basic principles: unity, balance, and emphasis. So open spaces open spaces in the built environment range from relatively underserved conservation areas to intensively developed urban plazas. Developed open spaces have both soft and hard surfaces. These outdoor rooms and corridors that I talked about, when humans scaled, appropriately furnished, and linked with walkways and bike paths, they do enhance community livability quite significantly. Public parks, waterfronts, and other open spaces are excellent sites for farmers markets, art exhibitions, musical performances, and other events that not only enhance a community's quality of life, but also increase its economic competitiveness. Well-designed open spaces add value to nearby real estate as well, and they provide places that enable active outdoor living. Lost spaces, typically poorly defined and often neglected spaces, are missed opportunities to improve a community's livability. Popular outdoor spaces, in contrast, tend to be human-scaled with a moderate to strong sense of enclosure. And when designed exclusively for pedestrians, these outdoor spaces can be can become very, very meaningful community assets. Livable communities, I think, provide transportation choices. For example, if you want to walk, you can walk. If you want to ride your bicycle, you can ride your bicycle. If you want to take public transit, you can take public transit. If you want to drive or ride your motorcycle, you can do that as well. So choices, rather than forcing you to choose one mode of transportation over another. Key design attributes include high levels of street connectivity, short blocks, medium density mixed-use development that are accessible to high-quality transit service. Usually pedestrian-friendly mixed-use neighborhoods include housing, shops, restaurants, and other services, as well as human-scale buildings and streetscapes. Livable communities place less emphasis on minimizing traffic delays, and more effort on traffic calming and increasing the safety and the convenience of transportation alternatives. These communities build pedestrian bicycle circulation networks that are separate from the motorized vehicle circulation system. And when integrated with compact mixed-use neighborhoods, well-designed pedestrian and bicycle networks can reduce daily vehicle trips and daily vehicle miles traveled, ultimately reducing the polluting impacts of vehicles on the environment. And then we come back to structures, because structures are sometimes part of the landscape, and and in the design and development of landscapes, the design and development usually involves the spatial articulation or refinement of the diagrammatic conceptual site plan. If a development pod on a concept plan is designated as single-family housing, for example, the next step would be to add walkways in addition to individual building lots or parcels. If the pod will be a multifamily housing cluster, design development would focus on determining the size, shape, and location of the footprint for the building or building ensemble. in the design of urban infill projects, new buildings are expected to be good neighbors and fit in contextually. Now, this fitting in is often achieved by echoing the mass, the massing, the scale, the proportions, or other design attributes of nearby buildings, at least when the nearby buildings are well designed. If not, then that's a different story. Now, articulating a building's facade usually involves choices regarding materials, colors, shapes, textures, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, by echoing or by mirroring the attributes of well-designed precedents in the neighborhood, community, or region, new buildings can enhance both the quality and the distinctiveness of the local built environment. So rather than building, for example, if the neighborhood looks like this, looks like the picture that you see in front of you, the two pictures that you see in front of you, if you are to erect a new building, then it is advisable that you follow or you mirror, you reflect, you echo the physical attributes of the neighboring buildings, rather than build something that is so ostentatious, so outrageous that it contrasts, that it starkly contrasts the neighboring buildings, and thus making your building, the new building, somewhat less of a good neighbor. I think some of these references are already available in a classroom should you want to take a look at it. Otherwise, I'll go have a look at it right after class. For those of you, I think I see the number of participants have increased. So for those of you who haven't marked your attendance, please do so already. And while we wait for our friends to mark their attendance, I'd like to invite you to deliver your comments or perhaps any questions that you may have regarding landscapes. Okay, well, I guess that's all that I have for you today. We will meet again next week for, what's the next component? Does anybody remember? For cities. Yay, that's something that we are a bit more familiar with. And we will explore cities followed by regions. Before I hand over the class to Pak Vendika. So thank you everyone for joining me today. I hope you have learned a thing or two, and I look forward to meeting you all again next week. Take care of yourselves. Have a great day. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam. Thank you.